Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for the conference organizers for inviting me to speak at the Southwest Florida Climate Summit. Congratulations to all of you on your continued effort to gather as a community of residents and professionals to discuss the challenges, our beautiful state of Florida and its people face from the pressures of climate change. I looked at the speaker lineup, and I was very impressed by your distinguished participants, which happen to include a number of old friends and colleagues who I regret I will miss seeing in person today. But if you're in the audience, I say hi, and I miss everybody. I join you today from Washington, D.C. Of course, my office is here, but I spend a great deal of time traveling across the country in this job, and everywhere I go, everywhere, I am confronted by communities that are enduring the impacts of climate change, not as a feared future phenomenon, but as a real-time phenomenon. And whether it is historic or catastrophic flooding, wildfires, extreme heat, drought, and of course more. And then, of course, in my portfolio, I oversee the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. The longer term changes in temperature, of course, affecting ecosystems and the economies that depend on them. Last year, the U.S. experienced 28 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. That is more than any other year on record, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And, this is a statistic. These kinds of statistics make a Floridian like me, and I'm sure many of you, just wince because our state has so often contributed to statistics like this. Just last year in August, Hurricane Idalia brought to the West Coast a storm surge as high as 12 feet and caused $3.6 billion of damage in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. And I don't know about y'all, but my own very unscientific perception as a native Floridian is that storms are also just not behaving as, we have come all these years to expect them to behave. So all the wisdom that I absorbed over a lifetime of hurricane season about how fast storms intensify, when in the season I should be watching the Atlantic versus the Caribbean, all of that wisdom feels a lot less certain to me now. And that's anxiety producing and concerning. And of course, hurricanes are not the only dangerous climate-driven phenomenon in our country. Climate change exacerbates, as I mentioned, conditions conducive to large and more intense wildfires, which imperil natural, cultural, and economic resources. Wildfires also have serious implications for regional air and water quality, human safety, and of course, as I mentioned, economies. When I travel in the West, you should know that I often hear a similar kind of things aren't like they used to be kind of impressions from folks. They tell me, for example, there used to be a fire season, like there is a hurricane season. There used to be a fire season, but now fire season is really all year round. And then, of course, there are the polar opposite phenomena of drought and flood, sometimes experienced as a whipsaw in states like Florida and California, for example. Deepening drought in the arid West has the states and tribes and natural systems of the Colorado River Basin, for example, managing through just unprecedented times. And intensified rainfall has delivered severe flooding impacts in communities and natural areas, of course, across the country. You can open any newspaper practically and read about those. And of course, Floridians experience climate-driven phenomenon far beyond hurricanes, right? We have sea level rise, drought, heat waves, freshwater algae blooms, red tides, deluges of rain, and of course, devastating coral die-off. And again, coming back to kind of my portfolio perspective, Florida's rich biodiversity faces the same phenomenon its residents and visitors do. Florida State University predicts that sea level rise will imperil habitat that 1/4 of the state's plants and animals need to survive. In many ways, Monroe County, where I was born and raised, could vie for the epicenter of climate-driven ecological change in our state. Species that live there, the American crocodile, key deer, Key Largo cottonmouth, Miami blue butterfly, for example, they were vulnerable before climate change. And now we're looking at some of those species really facing a very bleak future in the face of climate change. And then, of course, rising ocean temperatures and acidification, as I mentioned, are damaging our reefs in sweeping ways. All right, so I've run through the litany of climate change horribles, and none of those are news to the folks in this room. None of them are news to you, but I think it's important anytime we have a conversation like this to zoom in and out to remind ourselves of the size and scope of the challenge. As was mentioned earlier, I led Interior's delegation to the UN Climate Conference this year in Dubai just a couple of months ago. I could spend the rest of my time zooming out even farther to look at the effects that climate change is having across the globe, where nature, indigenous people, the young, and the poor have the most to lose in the face of climate change across the planet. So we are disciplined in reminding ourselves of the scope of the challenge, and we need to do that by zooming in at how climate change is affecting our own lives and our own communities, but also by zooming out to remember that we're not in this alone, and many communities are facing similar crises. It also helps us to level set the required scope of the response, right? To remind ourselves the scope of the challenge is to remember what the scope of our response needs to be. We must respond at all levels of community and government, right? So ideally, we're acting at the household level, and we're acting at the highest government levels, and then every level in between. And the conference that you're attending today, I think, is a good example of how we can keep track of, coordinate, and build all of those multi-level efforts, create synergies between them, and encourage each other as we implement them. From day one, the Biden-Harris administration made climate change one of the pillars of federal government action and investment. And as a result, President Biden has built the most ambitious, well-funded, future-focused, just, and inclusive in the history of our country. That is his conservation and climate response agenda. I'll say it again, is the most ambitious, well-funded, future-focused, just, and inclusive in the history of our country. The Biden-Harris administration created the National Climate Resilience Framework, which requires every federal agency. So this, when we often say all of government approach, but just imagine for just a moment what all of government at the federal level, what that means, the incredible sweep of resources and authorities that the federal government has across agencies. So this framework requires that every federal agency fights climate change within its own authorities. And by doing actions like as bolstering flood risk standards, strengthening building codes, protecting and restoring lands and waters, that's every federal agency. Climate change and resilience are at the heart of the president's Investing in America agenda. So that includes the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So President Biden's making once-in-a-generation investments in infrastructure resilience, including, for example, modernizing the electric grid, drought and wildfire response, nature-based solutions like ecosystem restoration, including coastal ecosystem restoration, river restoration. He has set the most ambitious renewable energy goals in our nation's history. In the Department of the Interior alone, along with our sister agencies, have centered our own work in the urgent need for climate change response. So I'll give you a few examples. We're implementing our own, just Interior alone, our own $2 billion restoration and resilience framework that's been made possible by the President Biden's Investing in America agenda. And these include restoration and resilience projects from Hawaii to Alaska to Appalachia. We are promoting the responsible deployment of renewable energy on the public lands that we manage. And we are working with our sister agencies to build an offshore wind energy sector. As land managers ourselves, and we manage some of the nation's most iconic lands, we are investing in the nation's most treasured landscapes, historical and cultural resources, to make them more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So whether we are replacing a boat dock, or we are shoring up an historic building, or making investment decisions about some of the most precious historical landmarks in our country's portfolio, we are folding climate change into all of those decisions. We are investing in urban green spaces. So we're going beyond the lands that we manage and have a statutory responsibility to steward. We are investing in urban green spaces, for example, to address Number one, inequity and access to the outdoors, which we know is a problem and which the pandemic made starkly visible to us. But we're also investing in those urban green spaces to address climate-driven change, like, for example, urban heat islands, which urban populations are coping with more and more regularly. As water managers in the West, we are pursuing resilient responses to deepening drought. And as the president directed us to do from day one, we are doing all of this work centered in inclusivity and justice, with communities at the heart of efforts like America the Beautiful, which is his initiative to seek to restore 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. So what does that mean? What does it mean to center our work in justice and equity? It means making sure, for example, we honor our trust responsibilities to tribes. And it means that we engage underserved communities to ensure that they too reap the benefits from the historic investments that I've been talking about. And of course, this pattern of bold record-setting action, it extends to Florida. So for example, the President has invested more than $2 billion in restoring the Everglades, setting a record many times over for federal investment in this, the largest ecosystem restoration program in the world. In Florida, we are working closely with the Department of Defense on the recovery of listed species and the protection of habitats that the Department of Defense stewards. We've celebrated recently in that partnership, we've celebrated some really big successes, like the recovery of the Okaloosa darter, a little fish, which was one of the very first species ever listed under the Endangered Species Act. It's now delisted because it's been recovered because of strong partnerships between Interior and the Department of Defense, and many other partners, including the state of Florida. And where the Fish and Wildlife Service is engaging tribes and stakeholders and the public on enhanced areas of conservation focus in Southwest Florida for the resilience of species, ecosystems, and recreation. You can, and I encourage you, because I do it myself, visit the web pages and social media accounts of virtually any federal cabinet department, and you can learn about how climate response is being incorporated into their work. I'm not kidding, from the Department of the Treasury to the Department of Defense. We find ourselves in a moment of sweeping challenge, but the Biden-Harris administration is meeting the moment with sweeping action and investment. I encourage you, please follow our work. You can start by following Interior social media channels to see all the great work we're doing across our bureaus. So not just the two best bureaus, National Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service, but all of our bureaus, Bureau of Reclamation, USGS, the incredible science that we're doing, including in Florida, our Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. You can follow all of that work on our social media channels. I mean, at the risk of sounding like, issuing all these shameless plugs, I really do want you to follow. You can follow me on Twitter or X at ASST SEC Estenoz, so Sec Estenoz, to come with me when I go to parks and refuges and communities across the country to see the challenges that they are facing and how we and they are responding. Like you, we at Interior and in the federal government and in the Biden-Harris administration, we think about the climate crisis every day and are working every day to meet the moment that we are in. Thank you for inviting me to address you today. Thank you for everything that you are doing to work together in communities of practice and in your own communities at home to address the climate crisis. I hope you have a fruitful conference and that when you leave each other at the end of the conference tomorrow, you are energized for the work ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Estenoz. We very much